Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Reba Letza, and I graduated from the University of Baltimore School of Law in May of 2019. So it is wonderful to be back virtually. I currently work as a litigation associate with the law firm of Baker Donaldson here in Baltimore. So as an alum and as a former student attorney in the Bronfine Family Law Clinic here at UB, I'm so pleased to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar, which is part of the Examining Structural Racism segment of UB Law's Law in Focus discussion series. So our topic this afternoon is Recognizing the Black Family, Structural Racism's Obstacles to Kinship, Wealth, and Prosperity. So over the next hour, our three panelists will share their views on how the family law, child welfare, and property law systems have historically discriminated against Black families in not only maintaining their family structures, but also in building and sustaining generational wealth. So I will be moderating this afternoon's discussion. Before I introduce our amazing panel, I would like to remind you all about the next webinar in this series, which is the ADA at 30, Where Have We Made Progress and What Remains to Be Done? So that event will take place on November 4th at the same time from 5 to 6 p.m. You can register for that event and learn more information about the panel on UB's website. So I'm so thrilled to introduce our panel for this afternoon's discussion. Serving on our panel, we have Professor Margaret Johnson. Professor Johnson is the law school's Associate Dean for Experiential Education, Director of the Bronfine Family Law Clinic, and co-director of the Center on Applied Feminism. Professor Johnson has been on the UB Law faculty since 2006, and she is a distinguished scholar on issues of gender, feminist legal theory, menstrual justice, and clinical legal education. Also joining us is Professor Sheldon Like. Professor Like joined the UB Law faculty this summer, and he teaches property law, trust and estates, and critical race theory. His scholarship focuses on anti-discrimination laws regarding racial and sexual minorities in a comparative context. Previously, Professor Like taught at Northern Kentucky University's Chase College of Law and Whittier Law School. In addition to holding a JD degree, Professor Like also has a PhD in sociology. Also joining us is Professor Shanta Trivedi. Professor Trivedi is a clinical teaching fellow in the Domestic Violence Clinic at the Georgetown University Law Center. Previously, she was a clinical teaching fellow here in the Bronfine Family Law Clinic at UB, so we are so thrilled to have her back. Professor Trivedi has also worked in the family defense practice at Brooklyn Defender Services in New York, where she represented parents in the child welfare system. Her scholarship focuses on state-sanctioned family separation and the impact of child removal. So in addition to thanking our amazing panelists for being here this afternoon, I would also like to thank you, our attendees, our audience, for joining us. We want this to be an interactive discussion, and we really want to hear from you. So if you have any questions at any point in the discussion, please submit them using the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can during the session. So this series on examining structural racism explores the many dimensions of structural racism in the law, how they interconnect, and the need for reform. This series was created by two of our UB Law professors, Professor Johnson, who we have joining us today, and Professor Audrey McFarland, after the tragic killing of George Floyd this past May. We've all been having these important discussions in our homes with our own families, in our classrooms, and in the workplace. And this series is a great opportunity to continue this discussion on a larger scale in an academic and interactive environment. So with that, I'd like to get today's discussion started by asking Professor Like to set the stage for why we're here today to discuss the Black family specifically. I understand that all families are distinct, but are there any distinct social or cultural characteristics of the Black family that you can identify?
Okay, yeah, I guess I'm not muted. Okay, good. I wanted to make sure I wasn't muted. Okay. Are there any distinct characteristics about Black families? I guess another way to think about it is like, why are we talking about Black folks really for this panel? And I think that probably one of the main reasons why we single out the Black family is because if we think about our nation, um, we think about race kind of sort of on this continuum, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. We tend to think about race on a continuum between Black and white. And part of our imagination is that kind of sort of on the bottom of a racial totem pole are African Americans and Black folks. And I don't want to kind of sort of engage in a form of an oppression Olympics to say that, you know, empirically speaking, that Black folks have it the worst, but it's definitely how we perceive Blackness as being at the bottom. And we definitely can look at Black families and Black bodies as a canary in the coal mine. So when bad things happen to vulnerable populations, it really affects Black people. So I think there's a saying that, you know, that when the nation gets sick or something like that, Black folks catch the flu. I'm messing up the metaphor. But basically, Black folks being kind of sort of amongst the most vulnerable people in the population, I think it's a good population to look at when we're thinking about kind of an uplift of those who are socially vulnerable.
Right. And several of those issues and practices that you raised were once the law in this country and had to be invalidated either by statute or by the Supreme Court. So I'd like to ask Professor Johnson and then turn back to Professor Lake to share your thoughts on some of the ways that the law has explicitly regulated Black families.
Sure. So we need to go back to the law of slavery, I think, before we move forward and look at other laws that have taken place in the United States. So under the slavery laws, people who were enslaved could not legally marry in any American colony or state because they were considered property. They couldn't enter into contracts. And if a woman who was enslaved was pregnant, the child status would be that of being enslaved if the mother was enslaved. So you saw the status passing from mother to child, unlike the common law, like Blackstone's common law at the time, where status was being transferred from father to child. So until about 1865, when slavery ended around that time, we find that the vast majority of African Americans could not legally marry. And what that meant is that there was no legal family, and legal regulation of families is what offers protection to make them sovereign entities where the state cannot interfere in how they react with each other, as well as issues of property and inheritance. If you don't have a legal child, then you can't have a child inherit from you any property if you were to own any. So that's one important piece of this. And you know, family trees looked very different. And there's been a reconstruction, and I think we have a link we can drop in the chat, a reconstruction of family trees in recognition now that, for instance, Sally Hemings is a part of Thomas Jefferson's family, and her descendants should be recognized as such. But that wasn't obviously recognized at the time. Other legal formalities, if you fast forward past the time of slavery, you see it continuing with what was called the Racial Integrity Act. This existed in Virginia and in other jurisdictions, and it prohibited people of color from marrying white people. So it was a white supremacy law intended to keep white people marrying white people and not marrying people of other races. And of course, the famous Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia from 1967, struck down that Racial Integrity Act and said that it violated both the Equal Protection Clause and the Substantive Due Process Clause on the basis of discriminating on the basis of race. And they traced it directly to being a white supremacist law. But there you see formal structures in the law trying to control who can marry each other based on racial classifications. Another place where the law has been very explicit about race came up in a 1984 Supreme Court case called Palmori versus Sidoti. There, what had happened was in the courts down below in Florida, I believe it was, a divorced white mother lost custody of her young daughter because she began cohabiting with a Black man. And her ex-husband moved to modify the custody arrangement, saying that simply because of the race of the person with whom she was cohabiting, she should not be able to keep custody of the child. And the Florida courts agreed with that argument. It went up to the Supreme Court, and in 1984, which I was saying to Reba, I graduated from high school in 1983. So the year after I graduated from high school, it took a Supreme Court case to say we cannot have race classification in custody determinations, implicating who has the right to have custody of their child. So those are the two, the slavery laws and then the two Supreme Court laws that I wanted to highlight that really show sort of this thread of structural racism in our law in composing who has the right to be a family and get the legal protections and benefits of being a family.
Oh, you're muted.
I would just add that we can also look to slavery, post-slavery, where once Black folks, particularly Black men, are freed, they aren't basically able to get a material base. So as the transition from slavery to freedmen takes place, there's no access to land or materiality. So as you look at Reconstruction post-slavery, we have the 1862 Homestead Act that had distributed all sorts of property that was in the South. As that starts to happen post-Civil War, post-1865, well, the Homestead Act explicitly excluded African-American men. We look, and then there's a Southern Homestead Act that passes right after the Civil War in 1866 that does allow for non-Confederate whites and for Black freedmen to take property distribution. But most of the claims by Black men tend to be denied. So we have a problem with respect to enforcement. So we look at 1862, there's a problem with just explicitly that Blacks are not even allowed to take part in this redistribution of land. And then even when they are kind of legally on the face of the law allowed to, then there's not an enforcement behind it. So we have that problem. And then also we can kind of fast forward to the 1960s, where there are racially restrictive covenants. So there are these covenants that are literally in a title that says that property cannot be sold. If you own property, you can't sell your house to a Black person or to an Asian person. There's a case called Shelley versus Kramer, it goes before the US Supreme Court, where a Black family purchased a home that had a racially restrictive covenant, and one of the neighbors wanted to enforce that racially restrictive covenant so that Black family could not live there. And the US Supreme Court struck down racially restrictive covenants in that case. So we do have a history of explicit racial bias with respect to land ownership and the accumulation of Black wealth. And then we do have some amelioration of those effects to an extent.
Reba, can I just throw one more thing in, because what Professor Like was talking about just reminded me of one thing I wanted to talk about with the slavery laws, is because there was no legal family, it meant that people who were enslaved were treated as property and could be sold off and separated. So we will talk about family separation. I know Professor Trivedi is going to talk about that. And I did want to at least bring this point forward that husband and wife could be separated, parent from child could be separated, despite the fact that, say, a father was sold from one plantation owner to another. There are these moving stories where fathers, when they had a break from the long labor that they had because they were enslaved, they would walk quite a distance to the plantation where their children were just to be able to see them. But they couldn't do that until they had finished all the labor that they had to do for being enslaved. The other thing that's quite heartbreaking is at the end of slavery, parents would post ads trying to find their children who had been sold away. They would go to plantations and take their children from the owners saying those children are no longer enslaved, you need to give them to me. And of course, the plantation owners were trying to treat them as indentured servants. And so they would place ads in newspapers searching for their family members. They sent letters to the Freedmen's Bureau trying to get the government's assistance to find their family, because they had been forcibly separated because the law did not protect their autonomy as a family. So I just wanted to share that, because I think it's something that gets lost in our history of family formation in this country.
And that's a really important point. And I would just like to ask for each of you to address whether there are any effects of some of the historical context that you mentioned about slavery that are still in effect and affecting Black families and multiracial families in the law today. Like, are some of those effects from slavery, are we still seeing those in the law today?
I think sort of disrespect or
Oh, Shanta, I'm having some difficulty hearing you. It's not clear. I think it might be the headphones.
something while I fix it.
Okay.
Well, I know Shanta will talk about her area of expertise with child welfare, and certainly you see this threat of child separation from the time of slavery to our child welfare laws. But I was actually thinking Professor Like could talk to us about the ramifications from slavery, the lack of ownership of property, because there was no ability to do so, or very limited ability to own any property, and how we see that now in the wealth gap. I mean, one of the things I was researching prior to this panel was this unbelievable issue of the wealth gap, that in 2016, white families had the highest level of both median and mean family wealth at $171,000 to $933,000, and Black and Hispanic families had a median and mean net worth less than 15% that of white families, from $17,000 to $138,000. That's a huge gulf in wealth. And I wonder, not to take over the questioning, Ms. Letza, but I am really curious about that connection between lack of ability to own property in the time of slavery to today, and wealth ownership of Black families.
Yeah, so you bring up some really interesting statistics, and I kind of sort of have a few more, because one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit was just kind of sort of the sociology behind the wealth gap, just thinking about these numbers. So the median in 2018, the median Black household had less than 11% of the wealth of the median white household. And when you look at wealth and the net financial assets of white versus Black families, you see that their wealth definitely sets them up to deal with emergencies in very different ways. So if a family had to solely depend on their wealth to survive at the poverty level for 3 months while receiving no income whatsoever, 38% of white households would not have enough wealth to do that. Okay? But you contrast that to Black families, more than double the number of Black families wouldn't be able to do that. 79% of Black households would not have enough resources to live at the poverty line for that same amount of time for those 3 months. So you asked the question of, how does that link to property, particularly to kind of sort of to slavery? There's so many things that lead up to that, right? There's so many histories that lead up to that. We can talk about the fact that, Black families aren't able to get property right after slavery, which I kind of sort of touched on a little bit. We can talk about the ways in which Black families weren't able to benefit from wealth accumulation through Social Security in the early 1900s, where most Black families tended to be domestic. The wage earners were domestic workers or Black farmers. So they weren't accumulating Social Security, so they weren't able to get those benefits. So there's a lot of things that go into that. And we can also talk about, and I think we'll get to this probably a little bit later, just thinking about issues of forced sales of Black land. So even after slavery, where there's no landed Black class, Black families are still getting property. They're still finding ways to get farmland. There are some people who are successful at getting farmland through that Southern Homestead Act. But even those individuals end up losing their land through forced sales, which we could talk about a little bit later, or now, if you want me to.
Oh, having some difficulty getting off mute there. But sure, we could talk about that now. I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on some of the legal or structural obstacles that you believe stifle the acquisition of wealth for Black people in America.
Well, so particularly just thinking about this example of the forced sale, and it's something that actually has gotten a lot of attention recently. So, you have these Black farmers who own property, who own land, and for whatever reason, they wouldn't write a will. So their property would pass through intestacy, and intestacy are the laws that take over when a person dies and they don't have a will. And usually what happens to your property when a person passes away, if they have children or descendants, their land is going to go to their children. So if you own some land and you don't have a will and you have 3 children, those 3 children will take that land as co-owners, and each one of them will have a 1/3 interest in that property. So they'll be joint owners. But if they don't have a will, then that property continues to be fractionalized as they have more children. And as their children have more children, property continues to be fractionalized. And as property passes that way, it's often in some states called heir property, and heir being H-E-I-R, so the heirs of the estate. It's known as heir property. So there's no clear title. These individuals who have these fractionalized interests, a 1/3 interest or a 1/10 interest, while they do have an ownership interest, they can't use that to go to a bank and take out a loan or leverage that property interest to do anything. So it becomes very fractionalized, and this is what ends up happening. You get some corporation or some land speculator, they find one of those family members and they say, hey, sell me your 1/10 share. And that person ends up, this land speculator buys that interest. And when you have a situation where you have multiple owners and each one of them gets to do whatever they want to with that land, what they can do is they can force a sale. It's called a partition. They force the sale of that property. And they can end up making a huge amount of money, or end up just forcing the sale as a way of controlling all of the property. So it's property that might be rare or property that might be particularly valuable that this speculator wants to use. So they force the sale, and basically they can either force it for a large amount of money or force it in order to take over full ownership of the property. And there's no way for the other individuals who might want to keep that land consolidated. There's no way for them to keep that land consolidated unless they can purchase all of the other shares. So it ends up basically being a way that Black families end up losing control of property. They might get money for their shares. So it's not a situation where they're not getting anything, but in a situation where land can eventually be more valuable than a payment, that land ends up leaving the family, and there's no way for them to get that land back.
And that's a great point. So how does Black families losing the property that you just talked about, and just generally not having as much access to wealth, what are some of the effects of that on the modern day Black family? I'd be interested in hearing from all of the panelists on this point.
Well, I think what we see is let's look at the statistics. So the cost of raising kids in the United States, anyone have a guess how much it costs per year?
30,000.
Oh, 14,000 per year. You know, this is from the Department of Agriculture from 2015. So, okay, it would go up a bit. About $1,200 a month to raise a child, one child. And what we see is that child support is used by, let's see, 51% of Black children in the US whose parents are not cohabiting are subject to a child support order. So how do you get the money to raise your child? It comes from the parents primarily. But if the parents are not living together, then there may be cause to get child support from the non-custodial parent. One of the things that gets quite critiqued is that if the custodial parent is getting public benefits from the government, well, then the government has the custodial parent sign away their right to collect the child support, and the government goes after the non-custodial parent to get child support. And that money doesn't go to the child or the custodial parent often. It instead goes to the government sort of to reimburse the coffers. And so a big critique is what the impact of, if you're looking at, as I said before, these demographics of a huge wealth gap when you're looking at the average income of a Black family, for instance, and the cost of raising children. So for low-income folks seeking public benefits, and then the government going after the non-custodial parent for child support, if that person doesn't have money, you can see then a cycle of an inability to pay child support that may end up with sanctions such as losing their driver's license or even being locked up until they're able to pay the child support. And so we have a statistic that 59% of single mothers receive a public benefit. And so then based on this benefit, the government may be going after those non-custodial fathers. And that low-income Black fathers are disproportionately subject to these orders. So I think you see a connection between access to wealth. Let's not forget about discrimination and race discrimination in the marketplace and getting jobs. So you see sort of a tightening of access to income and wealth. And then on the other hand, you see this issue of what are the public benefits that are available and who's using them, and then a child support system that then is really disproportionately targeting Black fathers and with quite heavy sanctions. So there's quite a movement out there that's talking about issues relating to child support and enforcement that needs to be reformed and perhaps focused on how do we get money to the children and to the custodial parent without penalizing someone for being poor, the non-custodial parent, and doing things that might undermine their ability to get work, such as license suspension and being locked up in jail. And is there a way, especially, to not have poor people having to reimburse state coffers, which comes at a great expense because they may not have the money to do that, and then that starts the cycle of penalties that come from it. There was one case study in Mississippi that showed that the child support debt is a major economic barrier for young Black men, and this barrier is especially intractable when a father's court-ordered child support debt is owed to the government to reimburse that cash. So there is something going on here with lack of access to jobs, income, employment, wealth, and then how our family law system through child support laws has been set up to try to compensate and support children, but then is somehow penalizing without really solving, penalizing people who may not be able to otherwise afford the child support without solving the problem. No one's sort of stepping back and saying, we need access to training. And I mean, people are saying this, but it hasn't happened yet. Training, employment, lack of discrimination in the workplace, and perhaps not reimbursing the government coffers, taking away jailing, taking away license suspension, and really trying to solve this problem of supporting children without penalizing poor parents.
Right. I'll interject here briefly. I think we got an excellent forward-thinking audience question that I'd like to raise here. And I think, Professor Like, you'd be great to answer this. What can we do today to help close the wealth gap for African Americans, since you spoke to the disparities and the wealth gap between Blacks and whites in America? Oh, you're muted.
I actually wrote like a real quick little answer to this as well. And I said there are kind of sort of four things that I like to think about. We need to strengthen housing and community stability for families, create quality jobs and higher wages, think about ensuring retirement security, and provide quality education. And these all sound like kind of sort of universal issues. I think that there's a way to think about universality, but still think about specificity with respect to people of color and vulnerable folks. And I can just kind of sort of touch on some different ways of thinking about this. So we can, if we try to strengthen housing, we can stop the harm of impending foreclosures by means of a principle of principal like redactions with respect to redlining and loan modifications, or loan modifications with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are these government-sponsored enterprises that buy mortgages on the secondary market. They pull them together and they sell them as these mortgage-backed securities on the open market. We can think about how to create more quality jobs with higher wages, have these goals for full employment in our country, which might be a controversial topic. And really think about public investment in the United States to have more innovation, build more infrastructure. We have like more roads, bridges. We have an internet, so people can actually have access to digital content. And then really think about having a living wage. Another thing is to think about kind of sort of ensuring retirement security. We can restructure Social Security, eliminate caps on Social Security with respect to the payroll tax. One of the things, we can also kind of sort of lift benefits, Social Security benefits for elderly people and folks that are more vulnerable, poorer folks that tend to be more disproportionately Black. We can create kind of sort of these retirement, kind of sort of these universal retirement accounts. Most individuals that are from kind of sort of a low income range don't have employer matched retirement accounts. So if the government was to kind of sort of establish this universal matched retirement accounts for low income families, and Black families in particular, because they're less likely to have these workplace retirement accounts, these universal retirement accounts could be under federal oversight. They could be established so that workers are automatically enrolled in them. And then they can have an opt-out option if they wanted to. And ideally, the federal government could also kind of sort of present a match up to like $1,000 for individuals who are low income and moderately income workers. And just lastly, thinking about providing quality education. We need to think about universal pre-K, especially for vulnerable youth. Studies show that early childhood development, early childhood education can help eliminate some of the achievement gaps that we see between different socioeconomic groups and between Black and whites. We need better and equitable state funding for education, for elementary education and high school education. What we normally do is we have this funded by property taxes. And the primary source, is the primary source for local funding are these property taxes. where, you know, these rich school districts end up having more resources than poor school districts. And what some states have tried to do is to ameliorate that disparity by using a formula that actually reappropriates those common funds. And those are just some things that we need to think about. I think those are all, you know, none of those solutions individually or even together is going to solve kind of sort of the problem. But those are some things that can help, I think, ameliorate that wealth gap. Last thing I just want to add, we can think about student debt reduction, right? And this is a really interesting statistic that I found. If you just eliminated debt and student debt in households that have the bottom 25 percentile of wealth, bottom 25 percentile of wealth, it can reduce the Black-white wealth gap by 39%. And that's just thinking about eliminating student loan debt for individuals that are in the bottom 25 percentile with respect to wealth. So these kind of sort of universal policies can end up eliminating racial discrepancies and racial disparities.
Thank you, Professor Like, for sharing all of those great points. So another disparity that we see that's affecting the Black family is in the child welfare system. So Professor Trivedi, as our resident expert, can you please explain how Black families are disproportionately impacted by the child welfare system?
Yeah, there are a lot of ways. And I don't want to take up the rest of our time, but I just want to highlight a few. And first of all, there's just large scale bias at every stage of the child welfare system. It's still statistically shown that Black families are more likely to have a child welfare case opened in the first place. Once that case is opened, they're more likely to have their children removed from them and then subsequently placed into foster care than white families who are more likely to receive services that would keep their families together. Additionally, Black families are more likely to have their parental rights terminated, and Black children are less likely to be adopted. So we're in this place where we have many Black children who have no legal parents because their parents' rights to them have been terminated, but there's no family that's been identified for adoption. Secondly, in many cases, poverty is often conflated with neglect. Black children in this country are almost 4 times as likely to be poor as white children. So when courts label situations that arise from poverty as neglect, that is going to disproportionately impact Black families. There's also a difference in the way that we treat substance use in white families versus Black. We're seeing that sort of brought to the forefront during the pandemic. There's been a lot of sort of lighthearted articles about middle-class families using, you know, alcohol and marijuana to cope with the stresses of the pandemic and to deal with their kids. There was an article in the New York Times about this recently. And in response, a lawyer that represents families in the child welfare system in New York wrote a letter to the editor saying that Black parents could never engage in this kind of behavior, especially not in the public way that people do in this New York Times article, because they're at risk of having their kids removed for that kind of substance use. And then finally, I think people don't realize the effect that mass incarceration has on the child welfare system. Many low-income people live in many low-income Black people live in areas that are heavily policed to begin with. And I don't have to tell this audience that police are more likely to investigate Black people. They're more likely to then refer them for arrest, to arrest them and then charge them, sorry. And as a result, we have 1 in every 9 Black children in this country has a parent who is incarcerated. Black men make up the highest percentage of incarcerated people, and the fastest growing segment of the incarcerated population is Black women. And the effects of this are incredibly far reaching. Of course, if it's a single parent who is incarcerated, that lands that child likely in foster care. An incarcerated family member means less earnings for that family, for example. And additionally, Black families are also more likely to be referred by the police to the child welfare system. So you can have the intersection of those 2 systems in a very real way, depending on the allegations.
So, Professor Trivedi, as a follow-up to that, you spoke about the conflation between poverty and neglect. I'd really be interested in learning more about how neglect is measured. For example, using me hypothetically as a judge that comes from a high-level socioeconomic status, I might be a health nut. I may feel that a parent feeding their child McDonald's or getting their child to school late or picking them up late or having pests in the home, I might feel that that's neglectful. So how is that standard measured, and is it entirely subjective?
So it's not supposed to be entirely subjective. If you look at the laws that define neglect, they're very broad and sort of vague. So, they essentially say that neglect basically means the failure to provide something, and that failure could lead to a risk of physical harm or mental injury. And many states, including Maryland, have sort of a carve out that says that neglect cannot be when that failure is due to poverty. But in reality, that's just not what we see. So, for example, if a family has unstable housing, and they choose to live somewhere, like squat somewhere that may not have heat or may have pests, like you said, they could bring a neglect case saying, well, they should have gone to shelter. That's a better option, and a safer option. But there's a lot of reasons why people may not want to go to shelter. There's been stories in the news about people who had their kids sit in the car with the windows down and a cell phone while they're inside doing a job interview because they don't have the money for childcare. Going back to the substance use, I had a client who went out at night, drank, and fell asleep outside of a shelter door while his kids were safely inside with their mother. I think that people go out and have a good time with their friends while the other parent is home all the time in middle-class families. Yet that family was dragged through the child welfare system for a year and were at risk of losing their kids. So I think these are the ways that we see them play out, in the very fine details and just the way that we treat families because of who they are.
Right. And you also mentioned that courts don't consider the harms that may result from removing a child from their home. I'd really be interested in hearing what some of those harms are. And Professor Johnson, if you also want to chime in here, that'd be great.
Yeah, so there are two large categories that I think of when we talk about what child welfare people call the harm of removal. So first, there's the trauma that is inherent in the removal process itself, right? The process of being removed from your family. And then the subsequent placement into foster care and the harms associated with that. So when we look at the first part, the trauma of separation, that's been in the news all of a sudden in a very, very powerful way because of the separation crisis at the border. And there's all this information coming out about what the long-term effects of separating a child from their family have, right? There was a statement by the American Association of Pediatrics that said that basically that harm was devastating and irreversible. And there's been books written about the feelings of grief and anxiety that children experience after being taken from their parents, even when their parents are not perfect. People talk about children mourning their parents like they died and going through that process. And then when we look at the harms of being placed into foster care, there's this idea that we remove children from these horrible situations and place them into Disneyland for the rest of their lives. And that's just not the reality. There's abuse and neglect in foster care that is well documented. Everything from medical education and educational neglect, lack of food, all of the things that would land a parent into court in the first place. There's major foster care instability, meaning that children are often moved from home to home. And as that happens, the risk of abuse goes up every time a child is moved. Also, the more a child is moved, the less likely they are to be adopted. Foster children have very high rates of mental health issues. There's one study that says that foster children on average have higher rates of PTSD than United States war veterans. Okay, adult people who have been to war, right? And there are also cultural harms, being uprooted not only from your parents and your siblings, but your community, and being placed somewhere totally different, where you may not be able to observe your culture, with people who don't look like you. You know, there are harms that come from that kind of total uprooting. And then when we look at long-term outcomes for foster children, they're just horrific. The long-term outcomes for foster children, ranging from health, education, to future incarceration, you name it, they're terrible. So it's not like we are making a choice between a potential harm and a definite better life. In many cases, the harm inflicted by removing a child is worse than the harm that would have been caused, even if the initial allegations were proven to be true.
I don't have anything to add to what Professor Trivedi has said. I think it's so important what she's saying and what she's writing it about, and I see the links in the chat. I have a couple of random thoughts that came out from what she said that I might share. And one is, she talked about mass incarceration, you know, of parents. And I thought this statistic was pretty incredible. And it goes to one of the questions I know we got in the Q&A about any legislative reform dealing with the child support issues. So over 400,000 incarcerated fathers have child support cases. And until 2017, child support agencies considered incarceration to be a form of voluntary impoverishment, such that the court could tag this incarcerated father with a set amount of income that he wasn't earning because he was in prison or jail, but the argument being, but for being in jail, he would have a job. He did something that made him go to jail. Therefore, he should be seen as voluntarily impoverishing himself and get some income imputed to him, and then he would have to pay child support from that. Well, all of the discussion that we've been having over the last several years certainly brings home the fact that there is wrongful arrest happening, especially targeting Black men, and wrongful incarceration. And so in terms of legislative reform, there was some reform that Obama brought forward in 2017, where child support agencies then stopped considering incarceration as voluntary impoverishment, such that income couldn't be imputed to those people who were inside, such that they would have to then start paying that they had no income to pay off. So that is one positive reform, recognizing this very difficult situation. We want children to have the financial support. We need them to have the financial support they need. And how do we do it if people are incapable or unable to have an income to pay that when the parents are separated from each other? The other issue that has been quite a debate in family law is this issue that Professor Trivedi was sort of relating to in terms of the cultural harms that come to children who are removed from families, and then if they're placed in families that are of, say, a different race or a different culture. And this has been quite a hot wire debate in family law relating to transracial adoption. In 1972, the National Association of Black Social Workers came out and condemned transracial adoption as cultural genocide. They said that it would be counter to Black children being able to self-determine themselves, that they should be raised by Black parents, that they need to identify with Black people in the Black community. And so to do that, they should be placed with Black families, that we need this to prepare Black children for the realities of racism in our country. On the other side, in 1994, there was a federal law that was passed called VIPA, and then revised a couple years later to be the Inter-Ethnic Placement Act, that banned any consideration of race in the placement of children by states. So it ended the practice of race-based considerations in adoption. And so there are in place, even in Maryland, we have a statute that says we can consider religious preferences in adoption preferences, but race is off the table. And I think this is a really interesting issue, considering the harms that Professor Trivedi talks about. And if you've read Dr. Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, you know, he talks about the difference between laws that or policies that discriminate on the basis of race and anti-racist policies. So this idea that is barring any consideration of race, yeah, okay, they're saying don't discriminate on the basis of race, but is that an anti-racist policy? You know, the National Association of Black Social Workers in 1972, and what Professor Trivedi is saying in studying the harms to children is saying it's not anti-racist to ban any consideration of race. In fact, it might help address some racism in society. So those were some of the thoughts I had listening to Professor Trivedi, which always makes me think a lot. So thank you.
And if I could just add one more thing, you know, when that question that we got about, you know, how we could be doing this better, right, to help families. Currently, many states spend 10 times more on adoption than they do on services to help families stay together or to help them reunify, right? If we provided the services and supports to ameliorate the problems that many families in this country are facing, we would set those families up for success and eliminate many of the other problems that we're discussing here, such as all of these harms. So that, you know, there is money that we are just using horribly and could be reallocated in much better ways.
Thank you. So I'd like to pivot by talking a little bit about bias and stereotyping. From listening to everyone's comments, it sounds like you're all saying that Black people, specifically Black mothers, sometimes fall victim to stereotyping and false narratives about parenthood. So using Ronald Reagan's welfare queen as an example, how has stereotyping affected society's perception of the Black family?
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, I don't mean to. Here's well, I guess, you know, one thing that was interesting in going back to look at child support for this panel was this, not only the stereotype of the deadbeat dad, which then creates the welfare queen, right? Because the single mom must not be getting money elsewhere. And needs to get money from the government, and then the idea that there's exploitation there. But also this idea that the single custodian mom is just going after the non-custodial dad out of spite or some other thing. I mean, there are these two competing narratives. And I think where the welfare queen comes in is this idea, it's a very easy, I don't know what it's like a smoke screen, or it's like a thing to distract you, to think that someone is exploiting access to TANF. Well, yeah, which is our current, that's not what it was when Reagan was talking about it, but it is what we have today. And our own colleague, Professor Michelle Gilman, has written an excellent piece that probably is going to be dropped in the chat, which shows that this is just a false narrative. The amount of money you're able to get on TANF is ridiculously low and totally unable to support the family and the number of children that you want. Plus, with welfare reform from the 90s, from President Clinton, there is a time limit on how long you can get that public benefit, and then you have to go into the job force, and the jobs that are available are very low wage. I think Professor Like has already talked about some of these low wage work issues, you know, lack of retirement and lack of access to wealth. So I think the stereotype of the welfare queen is a very convenient one for our society to not take a hard look at the true support we need to give to our families and children, because some of the systems we have, child welfare that Professor Trivedi was just talking about, child support that I'm talking about, you know, whereas the aim might have been positive and good, we're not actually effectuating the good that we want for our kids. And so really needing to rethink it, and thinking about the welfare queen and that someone is somehow taking advantage of public benefits that are minuscule is just a distraction from the real work that needs to be done.
So Professor Trivedi, I want to interject here. We got an excellent audience question for you. Is the removal of children from families well-intentioned, or does it reflect implicit bias or structural racism? Is it the equivalent to what happens to Black men in police violence?
I don't think anyone comes into the child welfare system saying, I'd like to come in and remove Black children from their families, or at least I hope not. I'd like to give people benefit of the doubt in that way. And I think, of course, there are situations in which children need to be removed from their families for their safety. But I think that those situations are much more rare than one would expect, because what we see in the news are the worst stories. And what the statistics actually show is that most cases that are brought to the child welfare system, and I mean significantly more cases, are there due to this idea of neglect that I talked about earlier, not the kinds of abuses that you and I picture when we think about the child welfare system. And I think that that is where the bias really kicks in some of the ways that I described. Because the neglect standards are so vague and amorphous, it really allows bias to penetrate at each of these stages. And I think, tying back to what you asked, about stereotypes, particularly of Black parents and Black mothers, the ideas that we have about what good parenting is very, it's a huge spectrum. And many of the players involved in the child welfare system bring their own morals, values, their own upbringing into the child welfare system. And I think one thing to remind ourselves of is there is actually no legal requirement to be an A++ parent. There's a standard of unfitness, which varies from state to state. And many of the things that land people in the child welfare system to begin with, and then inflict all of these harms on these children and these families that is often irreparable, would never rise to the level of unfitness.
It sounds like it actually, based on your answer, it sounds like it's very similar to policing Black bodies, with the police force, Black men and Black women. It seems like whenever there's discretion, so you're talking about the standards, whenever there's discretion, there's an opportunity for bias to take place. Police have discretion, right? And it seems like whenever there's this opportunity for discretion, there's also that opportunity for racial bias, implicit racial bias, whether or not it's explicit or implicit, an opportunity reigns in.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Can I just add just a quick line? I know we're almost near our time, but to sort of throw out some positive news, I thought that white and Black parents are equally likely to give themselves high ratings for their parenting. And also to say that they're doing a good job, and also equally likely to say that being a mother or a father is an extremely important part of their identity. And I think I know some of the Q&A is like, how do we solve some of these problems? I think one of the problems that can be solved is gender equality and family parenting, caretaking, and all of that. And I very much enjoyed the statistic to see how important it is for people, the recognition of their identity as being a mother and a father. Like, I think there's great hope for all of us across all of family law if we have more gender equality as well in our family life.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. Well, it looks like we are about out of time. I would like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today to speak on these important issues. I would also like to thank our audience for attending this afternoon's panel and for submitting such excellent questions. You've all made my job a lot easier, and I appreciate that. Please look out for the next webinar in the series, which is taking place on November 4th from 5 to 6 p.m. on the ADA. You can go register for that event on UB's website. Everyone, stay safe, keep dialoguing, keep learning, keep discussing these issues, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.